Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. And tonight we're going to turn our clock to the 25th of August, which is obviously today's date, but the year we're looking at is the 25th of August 1651, and this is one of many of our videos that we're putting into our Battle of Worcester playlist. Now, on the 24th of August 1651, Charles II, in theory, triumphantly went into Worcester and even knighted the mayor on the steps of the Guildhall for allowing him to enter the city of Worcester, really. But remember, the mayor of Worcester wanted those royalists, those Scottish invaders, to perhaps stay in the city overnight and then by this morning to continue their march south. However, the mayor of Worcester and most of the aldermen of the city had a bit of a shock when he woke up, or they woke up, to find the royalist army pretty much settling in. They were putting up tents in all manner of open spaces, and remember, these are only improvised tents. No soldiers really in the Civil War until the New Model Army later on got issued any tents. So all sorts of improvised shelters, and obviously billeting on houses were the norm. So the mayor and the aldermen of the city had a bit of a shock to see that these royalists were settling in for the long haul, really. We actually know Charles brought with him siege equipment, so if Worcester or any of the cities had specifically held against him en masse, he perhaps could have laid siege to any of them. We also know Oliver Cromwell brought siege equipment with him, and that was really down to the fact that he thought maybe the royalists would be too scared to come out into an open fight on the 3rd of September, and therefore there may be a third siege of Worcester. However, the clocks turned to the 25th of August 1651, and despite the royalists in Worcester preparing or restoring the city defences and settling in for the long haul, what Charles did not know, what none of the royalists knew, is that the Earl of Derby, this royalist Englishman that had took a relatively small army to the Isle of Man in exile when the war was pretty much wrapping up, he had landed, and if you think back to one of the videos we did earlier, we did mention the Earl of Derby lands in Lancashire. And the problem was, by that point, the Royalist army had passed Lancashire and were then in Cheshire. So basically, the meeting of these English royalists with the Scottish army moving south did not happen. So sadly, by the time the royalists enter Worcester, the Earl of Derby, with around about 600 to about 1,500 maximum, really, were actually still in the north. And what they decided to do is start heading south. And technically, they began their journey to Worcester, their proper true journey to Worcester, from Preston. And this is the battle that took place on Wigan Lane. Now, there had been a battle in Wigan Lane way back in 1648, and perhaps some of the soldiers involved in this fight may have been part of that fight as well. So the Earl of Derby, who landed in Lancashire, decides to try and catch up with the Royalist army, who has now entered the city of Worcester and were preparing Worcester for perhaps a siege or a full-blown fight with Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army. However, Cromwell had set quite a few soldiers across Britain, and the person we are looking at in particular was a man called Robert Lilburne. Now, Robert Lilburne is actually the brother of the famous other Lilburne, who was a leveller during the Civil War, and you must remember not to get the two mixed up. But Lilburne was a very good commanding officer and was in charge of a vast amount of New Model Army troops, really, about 3,000, and then perhaps some extra troops from the Cheshire Militia, for example, who had fought at the Battle of Warrington just days earlier, really. And what actually happened was the Earl of Derby brought his men from Preston and started heading south. Now, Lilburne wasn't 100% sure how big this army was, so was a bit more cautious than fighting them head on. And if you look at the battlefield, it is an interesting one, because when we think of battles, especially if you look at Naseby, Marston Moor, even Edge Hill, they're quite open affairs. And the battleground at the Battle of Wigan Lane is not like that. It's actually not very stereotypical of a battlefield of the English Civil War, pretty much any war, to be fair. Now, just a little introduction. This is the road that went south, and we know it was quite a wide road. When you read the descriptions that was wrote after the battle, it says a very sandy, wide road that actually snaked all the way through the countryside, leading into Wigan itself, which is just off the map at the bottom. The descriptions also state that on either side of the road there was very small enclosures, and they were enclosed with very, very ancient and very thick hedgerows. So what we've done here is we've started to divide the map up a little bit. This is not exact, purely because if you have a look on Google Earth, for example, at Wigan Lane today, the whole of this area is pretty much housing. There's terraced housing, and I do believe this is one of the main A roads that runs straight through between Preston and Wigan. So it's quite a busy road today, but there are terraced housing either side, and then there's houses on the back of that as well. So it's very built up. But as you can see on this map, and like I said, these hedges are not in the exact place. This is just a bit of a topographical illustration that we've used, or what we've drawn from accounts of the time. And you will notice I've done some very tight enclosures with hedgerows, very thick hedgerows. We also know from the descriptions that there was woodland, a lot of woodland on either side, and the most prominent feature ran down this side here, which is actually the River Douglas. So it's flowing along the edge there. So really, it's not the sort of battlefield that you want. It's not open enough for cavalry. It's not open enough for your pikemen to fight and your musketeers to fire. It's a very enclosed space. If you're going to fight, you're going to be fighting multiple battles in each hedgerow and each tree line and each little copse in woodland, basically. So the Earl of Derby's men on the 25th of August headed down this road, and we know the Earl of Derby was in the front there because he plays a prominent part in the fight, really. And they're coming down the road, and because Lilburne was a little bit cautious, he wasn't 100% sure how big this army was, he actually set most of his troops across the road and also across the fields, making the River Douglas his right flank and the left flank some of the enclosures. So it was quite a secure position if something went horribly wrong. But he could not use his cavalry, and he had a huge cavalry force, new model army cavalry. The only problem is this wasn't country for cavalry, so he actually sent forward dragoons, these mounted musketeers. He also sent forward some of his cavalry who actually dismounted, and then his musketeers. This is going to be a firearms fight more than anything, and he sent them forward to basically line the edges of the road and to get into the woods and into the hedgerows. And today we think of a hedgerow and think, well, the Earl of Derby must have seen these red-coated New Model Army hiding in the trees and in the woods. But to be fair, even I've worn a red coat in woodland. You don't show up as much as you think, believe it or not. Red exists in nature. Yes, it's not autumn here, but red does exist in nature. You get a lot of reds in the greens, reddy greens and things like that. So you're not that noticeable, believe it or not. So he would not have seen them, and he definitely wouldn't have seen the large numbers of them hidden behind the hedgerows. These are thick hedges. These are hedges full of trees, multiple bushes, and it would have been very difficult. They're not the hedges like a privet hedge that you can push your way through. You never get through them, basically. They were animal proof, and that's what they were designed for. So the Earl of Derby's men were in column as such, really, not in combat mode, so they weren't in battalion formation, and they were coming down the road heading south. And we know that as they got down the road, they were then fired upon. They were peppered, not volley fire, but they were peppered from the woodland and the hedges around Wigan Lane, and it was quite a violent but short engagement. So there would have been firing from every angle basically, and the Earl of Derby's men were in the middle. When you're in column, it's very difficult to actually do anything, but they did react to it. We know that they tried to form up, the musketeers would have volley fired back, and then there would have been a little bit of hand-to-hand as well. Swords being drawn, muskets turned round and used as clubs, and it would have been quite a violent fight, not just on the lane itself, but in the fields and woodland either side. Now, we know from the descriptions that the Earl of Derby led at least 3 separate charges into the Parliament army. So it wasn't a straightforward, let's run away, it's an ambush. The Earl of Derby was brave enough to take his English royalists and charge them straight into what would be a mass of musket fire and soldiers lined up awaiting their charge, basically. It was a very violent clash. Now, it could have gone both ways, but unfortunately for the royalists in this case, there wasn't enough of them. Maximum estimates in numbers was about 1,500, if that. The lowest number that most people believe is this army was only about 600 strong. Now, they had landed with less than that, to be fair, and they had actually recruited in Lancashire. Believe it or not, Lancashire did support the Earl of Derby quite a lot. So when the Earl of Derby landed there, he actually got quite a bit of support. So hopefully the Earl of Derby will win this fight and then continue on to Wigan, and then eventually into the Midlands, entering Worcestershire, and then joining up with Charles in the Severn Valley at the city of Worcester. And in a way, with 12,000 royalists in Worcester, this force of over 1,000 men would actually help Charles a lot. And psychologically, this is a big force of Englishmen. So if they can actually make it to Worcester, maybe other English people that were possibly sitting on the fence may have gone, do you know what? I am going to follow the king, because if the Earl of Derby is, I will also follow. So it will be a brilliant propaganda ploy if they win. And I haven't specified who wins this. Well, the Earl of Derby charged down this lane at least 3 times, we know, and there was a short, very short, but it said fierce and violent fight in Wigan Lane. And then shortly after, because the New Model Army are well trained and they're taught to stand their ground and pour out at least 3 shots of musket fire every minute, unfortunately the Earl of Derby's men started to falter, and we know a huge number was taken prisoner. Several men were laid dead in the lane, not vast numbers, believe it or not, and it's very difficult for me to tell you what the numbers are, because some propaganda leaflets say this many, others say this many. So the easiest thing to do is I will tell you some men lay dead in the street, but vast amounts were taken prisoner. Now we know towards the end of this short fight, the Earl of Derby himself managed to get through somehow, but he did end up in Wigan and he was looked after. Now bear in mind, he was badly wounded in this fight, but he was wounded and his wounds were tended in a house in Wigan, and they actually hid him in the house, and there was probably about 20 or 30 cavalry troopers with him, royalists, that managed to survive the ambush as such in Wigan Lane on the 25th of August 1651. Now we're talking about this as if it's happening. What you have to remember is Charles and the rest of the royalists in Worcester does not know this has happened. And the shocking thing is, Charles thinks the Earl of Derby is still on his way, gathering troops on the way down, and may actually bring huge numbers for the royalists in Worcester. But as I just said, the Earl of Derby is in Wigan, badly wounded, and with about 30 cavalry. 30 cavalry troopers, many of them actually wounded as well. So not the great numbers Charles was expecting. Anyway, this has been a little brief description of the Battle of Wigan Lane. There is a monument there today, so if you do ever get a chance to drive there, do have a look at it. And it's quite an interesting one, because today this is all housing, not woodland in hedgerows as it was in 1651. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.